If you care about your elo, don't even think about touching these champions. Hello summoners and welcome to another ProGuides video. Today's topic is the 10 worst champions on patch 10.17. So normally we tell you what's the best to climb with, but in case you aren't interested in playing the best, most meta champions, we're at least going to tell you what to stay away from so you don't find yourself deranking fast. But before that, today's question of the day is, who do you think is the most useless champion in the game? Everyone has that one champion that makes them feel like they're playing a 4v5 from champion select when they see a teammate lock it in. Let us know your answer in the comments below. And one last thing, be sure to visit us at ProGuides.com. We have the best roster of coaches, top tier live classes from instructors like Saskio and Mike Young, and courses covering a variety of roles and champions from your favorite pro players like Doublelift. We also have a brand new VOD review feature, and we're super excited for you to try it out. The way it works is you send in a replay file, and the coach sends you back a fully reviewed VOD. It's a super convenient option for when you have a replay you really want to go over, but you don't have the time immediately available to book a live session. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with top laners, Ryze is possibly flat out the worst of the worst, not just in this role, but even on this list. Historically, he's been a favorite of the pros, even when his stats in solo queue aren't doing too hot. But lately, not even they want to touch him. So if a champion that usually does well in pro play, but bad in solo queue, isn't even being touched by the pros, you know something is off. The reasoning for this? Sure, he provides early crowd control for ganks and he scales incredibly hard, but other champions just do what he does so much better. If you want a scaling hyper carry mage, play Cassiopeia or Vladimir, who both scale better for team fights and have stronger laning phases. If you want crowd control to force plays and snowball a lane, Maokai does it much better, and he can force fights with TP flanks with much more consistency. Setting up jungle ganks aside, his 1v1 laning phase is also pretty horrendous. Usually when you take a ranged champion top into a melee matchup, they either bully or at least just farm out the lane, but Ryze is completely unable to do that. And like we said before, he doesn't even have the hyperscaling of champions like Vladimir. So why willingly take a losing lane, give up priority to the other lane for Scuttle and Rift Herald fights, all just to play an okay scaling champion later in the game? Yeah, save yourself the trouble and just put Ryze away until they buff him. Lilia has had a rough start since her release, and with her jungle being so weak and prone to getting invaded, many players took her to the top lane. While this has technically been a bit better than her jungle as far as win rate goes, that isn't saying much. And she's still our pick for the second worst top laner to play on this patch. Ideally, on paper, Lilia wants to scale up to 2 to 3 items to have a tanky, AP bruiserish build to go in on and be on the enemy team, apply her dot, and use her Q's passive movement speed to prance around danger and sleep the entire enemy team. But in practice, she ends up in the same boat as Ryze. She's just an incredibly weak laner, giving champions like Jax and Fiora free farm to scale up without the ability to match them in the split. Other top laners like Ornn and Malphite just have a much bigger impact in teamfights with their on-demand engages. Lilia's issue is that her identity just doesn't make much sense in League of Legends, and she's not able to really fill one specific role well enough. Her CC is conditional, so she isn't reliable in Gauge, and her damage is too low to be a carry without building Glass Cannon. But if she does that, then she gets blown up the second she's in range to hit any enemies. So save yourself the trouble and pick a champion with a tried and true playstyle. And if you do love the AP bruiser annoying runaround style like Lilia, just play Singed. He's literally what she does, except better right now. If you play in the jungle, Lilia is jungle Singed. Just play it like a really annoying champion, but stay away from the top lane. With one of the most dated champions in the game, Udyr is definitely the worst victim of power and mobility creep in League of Legends. Sure, if someone stands still and fights him, he can win a 1v1. But the issue is, in reality, everyone knows to just kite him out. His kit, consisting of 4 auto-attack based abilities, means he provides literally no utility to a team, and he's hard countered by any composition with at least one solid source of DPS to burn him down as he attempts to walk in a straight line at his opponents. When looking at the meta melee champions, they have some type of redeeming quality that makes them viable. If Darius gets a hold of a single target and gets a reset, he becomes a terror in teamfights with his massive true damage ultimate. Garen removes slows with his movement speed increase, has a silence, and a true damage execute. The problem with Udyr is if he builds to deal damage, he gets melted before he can even touch his opponents. If he builds tank and does run down an enemy, he hits them with a single target stun and then can do nothing but smack them like a wet noodle. So if you want to carry from this super impactful role, do yourself a favor, either pick a real damage threat or a real tank and be useful for your team. This one hurts my soul, but Jarvan has been a staple champion for a long time in League, but he often rides waves of ups and downs, and at the moment, he's definitely on the down. Just earlier this season, he was a popular meta pick, but as things have shifted, he's fallen to the wayside. For starters, he loses the early game jungle matchups to pretty much all of the current meta picks, and the teamfight utility he provides later in the game just doesn't make up for it. When looking at bruiser champions, they usually have to be able to either provide a huge damage threat when diving the backline, or provide enough utility that they can build somewhat tanky and be useful in the mid to late game. The problem with Jarvan is that he doesn't want to build full damage. He just can't threaten backline targets. This results in everyone pretty much defaulting to tanky bruiser, or even just full tank build that locks down the enemy backline with an ultimate and hopes his team can follow up and kill the locked in targets. While this does sound okay in theory, compare it to a champion like Hecarim. He can dive into the enemy backline, disrupt the enemy team with his ultimate, and kill the enemy carries with his high damage build. And thanks to Conqueror and his W, he heals a ton, making him essentially a drain tank. And if you strictly want to be a tanky disruption bot, champions like Nunu and Zac just do it so much better. So opt for one of them if that's your thing. If you're like many other players that struggle to find what playstyle works for them, and you end up on champions like Jarvan, you should visit ProGuides.com and let us give you a nudge in the right direction. Believe me, I love this champion. He's one of my mains. He always has been. The problem with him right now is that ganking early was his strength, and now it just isn't worth as much as hard farming, which he kinda sucks at. To start off our mid lane list, we're going to be talking about the biggest hero to zero of Season 10. Syndra has been an incredibly dominant pick almost all year, but a few nerfs have done more than tone that back. She's just downright bad now. This is largely due to the back-to-back nerfs her Q received, both increasing its mana cost and lowering its damage. Forget trading with her opponent, Syndra struggles to even clear waves in the early game. When you consider that many of the popular meta mid laners are assassins and mages with strong, punishing early lane phases like Yone, Zed, and Orianna, it's super easy for most mid players to shut her down. And since her win condition is to be ahead enough to one-shot enemy carries in the mid to late game, the result is a burst mage that can't really, well, burst anything. If you want to play a burst mage hellbent on deleting enemy carries, pick up Annie. She was one of our champs in our OP pick or ban series on this patch. Be sure to sub to the channel and turn on the notifications bell to stay up to date on all of our OP picks to keep yourself in the know on what champions are best for climbing. Now, in theory, there is nothing wrong with playing scaling champions, but when you pick Corki, you're basically guaranteeing your team doesn't have a mid laner for half of the game. And once you do scale up and come online, you pretty much just provide damage and nothing else. Sure, he has the package, but it has a very long cooldown, and once you pick it up, the enemy team has to play back for a minute until it expires. It's just not worth having zero priority in the mid lane while the other laner is able to win scuttle fights or roam to other lanes and kill your teammates. When you look at other scaling champions like Azir and Kassadin, they just simply do it better. Much better. They can match or even outdo your damage while providing their own unique benefits. Azir has a pretty decent lane phase, his Q slows, and he has more than solid DPS. And with his ultimate, he can be a huge playmaker in teamfights. Even in the early game, Kassadin can somewhat contribute to fights once he has his ultimate. He transitions to being a slippery split pusher in the mid game, and at 16, he's a devastating assassin mage hybrid, able to wipe out entire teams in seconds. Then, we look back at Corki. He takes longer than both of these guys to turn on, and once he does, he's just not as useful. So either pick one of the stronger assassins we talked about before, or if you're going to pick something for scaling, at least pick a champion with a decent laning phase, not a non-existent one. If the enemy team picks a hyper carry bottom lane and you really wanted to shut them out, Varus used to be the go-to pick. With his constant harass, his kit makes him a lane bully, and since engaged supports were super meta, he paired well with them to shut out other marksmen from scaling. He dominated much of Season 10 with his lethality build, which made him an even bigger lane bully, and found him poking out the enemy team from almost a screen away from objectives. He was just too good at getting a lead and snowballing it, so he received nerfs across the board, with the most impactful being to his Q's damage, meaning his poke, the entire thing lethality Varus is dedicated to, was much weaker. The current meta for bottom lane carries is comprised of champions that have strong lane phases, such as Caitlyn, Ashe, and Jhin, that can match Varus' laning strength, but they just outperform him in fights, so there's just not really a place for him in this role. While she does see some play in the pro scene, Kalista is not a champion you want to be picking in your solo queue games. She has an extremely high skill floor, requiring really good mechanics to even be played at a decent level. Closing out games as Kalista also requires winning lane hard and snowballing that lead into mid-game teamfights. And in a solo queue environment, it's more likely than not that you won't have a team that's on the level of coordination that you need to pull it off. There are simply better lane bullies that are both easier to pilot and easier for your allies to synergize with, and all of them scale much better than Kalista. So save yourself and your solo queue teammates the pain and just stick to what works. This has actually been sort of a theme on our list. Champion is really strong, especially in pro play, so they're nerfed, and nerfed again to bring them down from their throne. The result is often them being overly weakened, to the point they are one of the worst picks in their role, and Tahm Kench is no different. Locking in Tahm Kench is basically trolling at this point. He provides no pressure in lane, making his ADC practically 1v2 for farm. His one redeeming factor is eating an ally to save them, but that ability has a 20-second cooldown, and using it slows you so much you pretty much feel like you've been crowd controlled. But you're doing it to yourself. Your ultimate also has practically no range early game, and since you're a support, it takes forever to get it up to rank 2, with you rarely ever seeing it at max rank. So he provides no lane pressure, has niche at best utility, and can pretty much be ignored by the enemy team in fights. Meanwhile, Nautilus and Leona can engage fights and dish out CC constantly, while the enchanters in the role can peel, protect, and buff their carries, enabling them to carry team fights. And right now, we've talked about it, the meta down bottom is to play lane bullies. So yeah, please don't lock in Tahm Kench for your sake and your team's. Following his rework, Volibear has been a smash hit, with his kit being so strong that he's been able to flex between top, jungle, and support, with a ton of success in all three roles. Even now, after a couple of changes, buffs, nerfs, he's okay as a top laner, but still really solid in the jungle. But he's abysmal as a support. He used to excel as support against the tanky engage supports that were meta in earlier patches, since Volibear is extremely durable with his shielding and healing, while putting out a lot of damage as long as he's allowed to hit the target. And since most lanes were just determined by who had the better all-in, you pretty much won everything. Now, the top tier supports are pretty much all enchanters, and when you're laning against something like Lulu or Janna, you're prone to being kited to death every time you try to go in. This weakness was made even worse when Riot did a huge nerf to his Q's movement speed on 10.16, making it even harder to close the gap in lanes that were already almost unplayable. Much like Tahm Kench, he just doesn't provide any pressure in lane, and you have tons of other options to either win lane or scale up and be useful. And that wraps it up for the 10 worst champions on 10.17. Remember to let us know what champion you think is the most useless down in the comments. And make sure to check out our website for more in-depth content and guides that were made by your favorite pro players and streamers. Thanks for watching, and good luck on the Rift.